plastic, like a translucent. And I fiddled with that until I got something that I liked. Changed it to like a slight yellowish color, and then placed inside of each one a second smaller sphere that I used as a light emission source. And what I did was I animated bringing that light emission source up for uh, two or three of the spheres, and then they would reduce in intensity while the other spheres would increase in intensity. And it would just go back and forth. It was a really, really simple animation, and it looked stupid animating it, but that's not the point. And then I also rendered out the background. And when I had those three sets, what I did was I combined them like this. Um, the movie clip of the Enterprise was here. The background stars is here. And oh, this might be an earlier one where I just did the Enterprise and the stars. I took the resulting animation and then I added the Corbomite ship, Balak ship, on top of that. You can even see where I added in the noise, though I hadn't really intended to show that, which simulates film grain. So that whole sequence is definitely mine, and it is mainly comprised of this background and this shot of the starship, and then I'll include the actual end sequence, which is only a few seconds, where you see the camera getting closer and further away. As a matter of fact, if I go here, you can see my wireframe, and the highlighted the orange, bright orange box actually represents the camera that I used for this. And here's how it's animated. You can actually see the spinnerets inside my warp domes spinning around, and other cameras moving. Because again, I used this over and over again, this lighting setup to film other things, including the approach shot, a couple of different approach shots, as a matter of fact, from different episodes, like the approach shot, which I absolutely love from Metamorphosis, and the approach shot, which was shared between Balance of Terror and the Doomsday Machine. So you can actually see bits of those approaching there. And whichever one is rendered out depends on which camera is selected. So you're actually seeing the motion of the animation that I set up for this, because it was between frames 1 and 360. I wonder if I can do this while the animation is going on. I guess I can. Although maybe that's a stupid idea. So here we go. You're actually seeing the same animation again, with my textures and materials being shown on the screen, which is why a little slower. And then if I was to render any one of these out, it would be just like you saw before. You would see a much more realistic image of the ship. But of course, if I was to switch to rendered right now, it would take minutes, about 10 minutes per frame. And there are 360 of them. So I tend to render these things out overnight. When I had my previous computer, even with this one, with an extremely complex shot, I have rendered out sequences for days at a time, and just use a laptop for work when I have to. That's because rendering out these sequences, especially the more complex they are, the more vertices or lines or quads that you have, or triangles in any one scene, means the more that you have to render. The more that you have to render, the longer it takes. That's going to change with the next iteration of Blender, Blender 2.8, which will use something called VVEE, I think, or something like that. EEVEE. And it's got a real-time rendering system, which looks fantastic. It almost looks as good as Cycles. Um, and if you just Google EV Blender, even if you just do EEV and Blender in a search on YouTube, you'll turn up some demos of it, and you'll turn up announcements from blender.org and see some demonstrations of what they're going to be able to do with this when they perfect it, when they get it so that it runs quickly on most users' PCs. That's going to revolutionize special effects, because you'll have people using Blender and EV to set something up, and then they won't render it so much as they'll simply play the animation and record the results. Kind of like what I'm doing here. If this was more realistic, I could use it as the animation, but I'd want to put in the background, and I'd want to put in the alien spaceship as well. But I don't think any of that matters. You've seen some insight into how I put this together, how I use the node system in Blender to actually assemble my shots that have alpha backgrounds. I tailor each section of the image, the background, the foreground, the ship, if there's an alien ship, or if there's a star, or if there are asteroids. Each one is its own layer, and then I can control them in the node setup in Blender. It's actually a really fantastic system, and the fact that it's free and produces these absolutely fantastic results with just time and effort blows my mind. I think Blender is starting to be used in industry more often. As a matter of fact, if you, oh man, what did I search for the other day? I did a search for Blender. I wanted to see what the latest EV results were, or see if they could give us an updated timetable on when Blender 2.8 is going to be available. And I ran into a post of a gentleman who does special effects work for a living, and he uses Blender to produce special effects for movies and television shows. That's spectacular. He did some rather simple tricks and some unbelievably complex ones. It was wonderful to watch, and he's got talent beyond my ability, and he's also got access to different levels of professional software, which I don't have. But when it comes to the original series of Star Trek, or what I just call Star Trek, because everything else isn't really Star Trek, that's my hobby. This USS Enterprise is my model, and this is how I make my images in Blender using my model. All the movies that I post are mine. I would never claim somebody else's work. I did promise something else, however. I did promise earlier that I would show other people who have used my previous version of the Enterprise, which I built in True Space. So this is my old True Space model, and I can pull up pictures of it that I've rendered. But this was when my friend Chris Martin, who goes by the handle of Evil Genius 180, I gave him a copy of my ship. He was interested enough to download it. You can see that there were some shortcuts I took, like I only had materials on the veins back here. True Space took a lot longer to render, but he made my old ship look, I think, very nice. This was done by Dave. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Meteltsitz. Anyway, he downloaded the same model and did his own render of my model. As a matter of fact, it says right here, Sci-Fi Eric's Enterprise, down in the lower left-hand corner. Just like indeed did Chris, Enterprise by Eric Reinholt, Sci-Fi Eric, and Image by Chris Martin. Absolutely, he did a great job. I like how he lit it and filmed it, or took rendered it. And I like Dave's. Dave's made it look almost real. I think he uses different software than I do. I think he uses Lightwave or something and converted it. Oh no, Max. He was waiting for my model. How about that? And he converted her over to Max and rendered it. So he did a very good job. Earlier versions of my renders are available with a simple Google search. And also, an awful lot of these are current. And of course, not all of them are mine. This one is definitely mine. But let's see what else. Yeah, here's one I did. It's actually the same enterprise. Yeah, might as well just go get it. One second. Here are some of my slightly older shots. These aren't that old, a year or two, but this was made with my current Blender Enterprise in 2016, so 2 years ago now. I overdid it a little bit with the noise, but even Star Trek here is actually a mesh, the text. I typed that out in Blender and then started to soften the edges because the edges were softer than the Star Trek fonts you can get. They always tend to have sharp edges. And the actual Star Trek text for the series was painted on a cell. So they took their time, they had rounded edges, it was very pretty, and I wanted mine to look more like that. The red planet in the background is one of mine, but I used an Earth uh, uh, cloud texture with an alpha that I got from NASA's website. So the red planet doesn't exactly match, and I'm going to be making a new one anyway. But you can see this actually had the heavier textures, but you almost don't see anything just because of one, the film grain, which is noise, and two, because I wasn't using the Blender Filmic color management system at that point. I don't think I was using it here either. Same model, different materials for the dish, but then I can do that. It's my model. And then I added the phaser shot, the phasers I think I did that in Adobe, yeah, Adobe Photoshop version 7. Now this is the same model the week that I started using Blender's Filmic color management system. And as you can see, the textures are really pronounced. There, you can see this line where I arbitrarily altered from streaks to just a black dirt texture to a brown dirt texture that fades out as you go towards the back. And I didn't actually intend for you to be able to see the three different ones. What I wanted you to see was that there was obviously some difference in the panels between all of them. And then I changed how I rendered all of that using different contrast levels in Filmic color management system, and lightening down my textures. And I can show you that one too. That would be here, and here is one of my latest shots that I did. In the 1960s, when they would show Star Trek, Star Trek was anywhere from 50 to 55 minutes in length. So I mean, there were actually very few commercials back then, only about 5 to 9 minutes of commercials per hour. And what they would do to keep the audience to let the audience remember what they were watching was they used to use what were called bumper images. Now this one's different. You'll notice that all the edges are very sharp in the text for Star Trek. I just used the Star Trek title font in Adobe Photoshop and added that on top of my render. So this is my take on one of the bumper images that they used to show in the 1960s. It's similar to one I remember from when I was a kid. The other one was that other Star Trek image I showed you with far too much film grain. Here's a one frame from the animation that I made, and you can see that the angle is similar. There's my Balak ship in the background with the 5 spheres, and my particle system for the stars for this image. And I did that last year in 2017. I'm still tweaking things and changing them. Like I've got to change my bridge and the upper sensor dome here, because the upper sensor dome is a little too small, and the bridge should be larger on the BC deck. But that notwithstanding, this was the first image that somebody said, "Oh, I remember this shot from